Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Meryl Richards and I'm the moderator for today's live streamed launch event for the Ceres Investor Guide to Deforestation and Climate Change. I'm also Director of Research on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres. We're a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies from around the world. Before we start today's session, a few notes on logistics. First of all, please note that this session is being recorded and the recording will be shared with all of you afterwards, along with a copy of the investor guide. If you have any questions during the session, please enter them into the chat box that's located on your control panel. We won't be doing a live question and answer session, but we will try to answer some questions in written form after the session. If you have a technical question, such as you can't hear, your audio is not working, please feel free to raise your hand and we'll aim to answer your question as soon as possible. If you are having trouble accessing audio via your computer, we have a series of dial-in numbers that you can dial in via your phone listed here. We'll leave this here for a few minutes, but if you happen to forget to mark down the appropriate phone number, feel free to ask us through the questions function and we can provide that to you. Please note also, given the strange times that we're in, there is a potential for internet bandwidth issues and we may experience some connection challenges. Hopefully this won't happen, but if it does, we'll pause the discussion for about 30 seconds to allow the bandwidth to readjust. Thank you ahead of time for your patience if we do run into such technical issues. So let's get into the session. I want to thank each of you for participating in today's event, and I'm especially grateful to our speakers, Michelle Edkins, Adam Kanzer, and Jimmy Yen, for joining us today to share their views and experiences. Michelle, Adam, and Jimmy served as our 3 investor reviewers and provided extensive input throughout the development of the Investor Guide to Deforestation and Climate Change. I'll give each of them a quick minute to introduce themselves. Michelle, let's start with you. Can you please give the audience your current position and just a couple career highlights?
Sure, thanks, Meryl. So as the cover note says, I'm a managing director in the investment stewardship team at BlackRock. We have a team of just shy of 50 specialists who are coordinated globally through colleagues in roles like mine, and then very much organized locally to be present in local markets and establish relationships with companies locally, as well as with regulators and other actors in the market. The team's responsibility or purpose is to advocate for corporate governance and business practices that are aligned with delivering sustainable long-term financial performance. And in that construct, I lead on institutional relations, which is our public outreach, communications, and policy positions. You also asked us to talk about a couple of career highlights. One was, for me, serendipitously, finding myself in a corporate governance role about 20 years ago, because I'd come from a background of economics and diplomacy, and corporate governance is this perfect mix, or stewardship is this perfect mix of how the logic of business meets the people of business and how those two things work together, complement one another to achieve success, or sometimes less than success.
Fantastic, thank you, Michelle. Adam, would you like to go next?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Adam Kanzer. I'm head of stewardship for the Americas at BNP Paribas Asset Management. We're the asset management arm of the French bank. So I've been in my role as head of stewardship I'm responsible for corporate engagement on environmental, social, and governance issues for my region, as well as proxy voting and public policy. We have placed deforestation as really one of the key pillars of our global sustainability strategy that we launched last year, which is focused on the transition to a low carbon economy, environmental sustainability, and equality. Deforestation is a key systemic risk, which, as we'll get into a little bit later, encompasses human rights, water issues, biodiversity issues, climate change. It's so critical. So I'm really excited that Ceres has put the effort into this great guide, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Adam. Really grateful to have you on today. And Jimmy, let's turn to you.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Yen. I work in the office of the New York City Controller, Scott Stringer. Within the Controller's Office, I'm Special Counsel to the Chief Investment Officer in the Bureau of Asset Management. The Bureau of Asset Management serves as the delegated investment advisor for the New York City pension funds. Collectively, the 5 New York City pension funds have about $200 billion in assets under management, or around the 4th largest pension fund in the US. My key role is leading our work on ESG and sustainability and asset allocation and investment policy. I've been with the Controller's Office for about 6 years. Before that, one of my roles in government was serving as a trustee to one of the city pension funds. The city pension funds and the Controller's Office have a long history of integrating ESG in our investment processes. So as we recognize ESG and sustainability factors as material risks and opportunities for our portfolios. We've collaborated with Ceres a lot, and I was happy to serve as a reviewer on this guide because of the importance of deforestation.
Thank you. So welcome, Michelle, Adam, and Jimmy, and we look forward to getting into the discussion with you in just a couple minutes. Before we do get into the discussion, I'll briefly introduce the Investor Guide to Deforestation and Climate Change, which Ceres is launching today. It can be downloaded from our Engagement Chain website at the link that you see here. I'll tell you a little bit about why we wrote it, who it's for, and then give you 4 key messages that I'd like you to take away from the guide. So first, why we wrote it. We wrote the Investor Guide because, from my perspective, we're approaching a tipping point in 2 ways. The first tipping point concerns the climate. According to the IPCC's special report on climate change and land, which was released last summer, the window of opportunity for limiting climate change within tolerable boundaries is rapidly narrowing. And as the report made clear, we can't limit climate change within those tolerable boundaries without protecting forests. The second tipping point is a rapid growth in action on deforestation among institutional investors. While a core group have been engaging on deforestation for many years, that group is growing fairly dramatically. As an example of this, last October, in response to forest fires associated with deforestation in the Amazon and in Bolivia, 251 institutional investors with 17.7 trillion in assets under management called on companies to take urgent action to eliminate deforestation from their operations and supply chains. This was really unprecedented for an investor statement on deforestation. And what we at Ceres have found from speaking with investors in our networks is that among the many impacts of deforestation that Adam mentioned, for many of them, the urgent and systemic risk of climate change is really top of mind. Now, some of these investors, as I said, have extensive experience with deforestation, but there are many who are really just beginning their engagements with companies on the topic. And this guide is really for that second group. Institutional investors, particularly engagement specialists, who have perhaps joined a sign-on letter, but don't yet have extensive experience addressing deforestation in their portfolios, and maybe aren't yet comfortable bringing the topic into a company dialogue. And while institutional investors are the primary audience, the guide can also be very useful for companies who want to understand their exposure to deforestation, how it contributes to their greenhouse gas footprint, and start developing or improving their policies to address it. So there are 4 key points that investors and also companies should take away from the guide. The first is that deforestation really is a significant driver of climate change. According to new research from our scientific partners, tropical commodity-driven deforestation alone contributes 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. When that's then combined with all other sources of emissions from land use change, such as degradation of boreal and temperate forests and conversion of grassland ecosystems, the total is 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, because of the potential to not only avoid emissions, but to actually sequester carbon through forest restoration, forests are much more than 5 or even 11% of the solution to climate change, which is a point that we'll touch on during the discussion. The second key point is that investors have potentially broad exposure to deforestation because the greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation are embedded across an investment portfolio. The 9 commodities shown here account for nearly 80% of greenhouse gas emissions from tropical commodity-driven deforestation, and the remaining 20% are due to a wide variety, a pretty long list of other commodities. So there are many commodities involved, and companies in many sectors and industries are exposed. Because it's not just food companies, it's also manufacturers of personal care products, hotels, apparel companies, a wide variety of companies that source commodities like palm oil and paper and rubber that are associated with the destruction of tropical forests. And neither is the risk limited to investments in emerging markets. Nearly 40% of deforestation-related greenhouse gas emissions are driven by international trade. And some of those emissions end up embedded in the supply chains of US and European listed equities. So this is a risk that multinational companies and their investors have exposure to and therefore can potentially influence. And the third key message is that eliminating deforestation from company supply chains can significantly reduce corporate greenhouse gas footprints. As an example, by eliminating deforestation associated with soybean production in Brazil, the greenhouse gas footprint of soybeans could be reduced by 39%. So just by tackling this one issue, soy traders or companies sourcing soybean oil or chicken and pork products that use soybeans as feed can make a significant dent in their supply chain emissions, which, as we know, for food companies especially, are a very large proportion of their overall greenhouse gas footprint. Lastly, companies with exposure to deforestation should make eliminating it a key component of their strategies to address climate change. This means three things. They should include greenhouse gas emissions from deforestation and other land use change in their greenhouse gas reduction targets. They should develop and implement no deforestation policies as part of their climate action plans. And they should then disclose on progress on eliminating deforestation along with progress on their greenhouse gas targets. You'll hear more about many of those points from our speakers today, so now let's get into the discussion. So let's start with Jimmy. Jimmy, we were really grateful to have input from you and Adam and Michelle throughout the development of the guide. Could you tell me a little bit about why you agreed to be a reviewer?
Sure. Like for many asset owners, climate risk is a high priority for us. We believe that climate change is a source of systemic risk and opportunity that's generally mispriced in the market that we have to proactively address. We also know that deforestation risk is an important part of climate change risk. Based on this, we've supported shareholder proposals and signed joint letters to address deforestation, such as letters to strengthen the criteria for certifying sustainable palm oil production, which is of course a deforestation issue. And some of these letters were coordinated by Ceres. So we're always looking for ways to enhance how we address climate risks in our portfolio. And since deforestation risk is a major climate change related risk, we need more resources to understand it. We also recognize that deforestation is an important risk issue standing on its own, given its profound impacts on environmental sustainability, biodiversity, human rights, and other areas, like Adam mentioned. While I'm very far from an expert on deforestation and made that very clear to Ceres early on, I agreed to help review this guide because I thought it'd be a meaningful resource for investors and for us here in our office. So essential questions I was interested in were, for example, how does deforestation fit into frameworks of climate change, such as scenario analysis, fiscal risk, transition risk? How do you explain the financial materiality of deforestation? How can we talk about deforestation as a climate solution in addition to a risk for company engagement? I appreciate the opportunity to give input on this guide and hope it can help move the conversation forward for all asset owners and investors.
Thanks, Jimmy. And to follow up on that, there was one graphic that we included in the guide that you said you found especially striking. And some of our other investor reviewers did as well, actually. And it was this figure which shows how much protecting and restoring forests and other natural ecosystems could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon relative to some other solutions to climate change. Could you talk a little bit about what you found surprising or striking about this figure?
Sure, yeah, I thought it was obviously pretty surprising and also not surprising that a number of other people found it very interesting. That figure 2, I think it is in the guide, it shows how much deforestation might contribute to the reduction of GHG emissions, essentially, in the context of the Paris goals. Based on this chart, deforestation solutions, quote unquote solutions, might account for nearly 3/4 of the climate mitigation from all renewable energy technologies in order to reach the Paris goals. This is surprising because when you think about climate mitigation or climate solutions, you reflexively think about almost entirely about renewable energy. Deforestation is not always in the top tier of issues in mainstream discourse. One basic example of this that came to mind comes from looking at the taxonomies or classifications of data providers that they provide for climate solutions or environmentally sustainable activities. Typically, you don't see the word deforestation as one of the categories. You'll see key components of deforestation, such as things related to natural resources, but deforestation as an organizing principle in basic taxonomies is not common, at least in my experience. There are likely good practical reasons for that, such as the availability or form of the data. So this is not meant to be a critique of the data providers, but it shows one way in which it can be challenging to visualize the impact of deforestation unless you've already developed a view about it, a cogent view. There are a number of other things in the guide that I didn't really know about, such as the huge breadth of commodities related to deforestation, as Meryl mentioned, and the wide range of sectors. So overall, I thought the guide showed a lot of interesting information about the many dimensions of deforestation and its impacts.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, and the need for, or the lack of that information in some of the common data providers is something that we hear fairly often. So that point is well taken. The next question is for Michelle. So BlackRock has been working with portfolio companies to address deforestation for some time. Why did you or BlackRock decide that this was an important issue to address, and how do you bring it into your engagements?
Absolutely. So environmental and social issues, or risks and opportunities as we talk about them, have been part of our engagement strategy for a long time, because we see how well companies deal with these business issues as signals of management quality and operational excellence. And as our clients are long-term investors, we want to see companies operating to high standards, because long-term investors bear the consequences if companies fall short. The sort of formalization of our approach was really a byproduct of my involvement in a working group that the OECD put together for implementing the responsible business conduct guidelines for institutional investors. Institutional investors were not really involved in the development of the responsible business conduct guidelines, and so the point of this working group was to translate what's directed to companies over to investors and their responsibilities. And that framework really clarified how investors can influence businesses in their practices in relation to responsible business conduct. And since then, we've been building more specificity around a number of environmental and social considerations into our approach at BlackRock. And so we are seeing our policies and our practices continue to evolve as we do the engagement into points already made, learn from that, get feedback from companies and others, review the information that's in the public domain, and see how we can build that into our process. And increasingly, we're disclosing more as our clients make clear their interest in this area. And similar to the points that Jimmy's made and came through very strongly in the report or in the guideline, or toolkit, the interconnectedness of deforestation, climate risk, society, the ability of agriculture to actually be sustainable. These are all very closely tied together, and hence our focus on deforestation and how companies are managing and mitigating their land use impacts, and how they're checking through their supply chains to ensure that their suppliers are operating to high standards in relation to deforestation.
Great, thank you, Michelle. We'll come back to that point on suppliers in a bit. Moving to Adam. So one key message of the guide is that addressing deforestation should be a part of corporate climate strategies. And companies need a no deforestation policy along with other emission reduction strategies that they might be developing as part of their climate action plan. But one point that you mentioned in our discussions is that just having a no deforestation policy isn't enough. investors can't assume that a policy alone mitigates the risk. Could you elaborate on this point a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's like all supply chain engagements. You know, policies are important, but implementation is where the real work takes place. And investors really have no way of actually knowing whether a company's policy on paper means anything in the real world without wrestling with the details of implementation. I sort of hesitate to make this point a little bit because, you know, coming back to Meryl, I think what you said at the outset of the call, which is that the guide is really directed towards investors that have not done a lot of work on deforestation and are looking for ways in on this issue. And so I don't want to set any additional obstacles for investors to get involved. But I think it is important to recognize that there are real levels of complexity here that differ by commodity. Palm oil is very different than beef. It's very different than soy, very different than pulp and paper. That's very different than rubber, right? Each of these is different. Each of these present different problems and they present different solutions. And to really wrestle with those and to really have an impact on the ground, you have to get past the policy. But first, start with the policy, right? Is the policy itself adequate? We see a lot of claims of 100% compliance. You know, and a lot of companies made 2020 commitments to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains. I think very few companies met that goal. Some claim 100% compliance until you dig in and you realize the policy itself is lacking. So you always begin with the policy. You begin with its limitations. Why was the scope set the way it was? And wrestling with that introduces the obstacles that the company faces, you know, in the real world to implementation. So for palm oil, for example, is the company aiming for 100% fully segregated RSPO palm oil or 100% mass balance? What's the role of book and claim certifications in that? You really have to kind of understand these balances to understand whether this policy is really directed towards true no deforestation. And as you work through this, you kind of lead into implementation. You're always going to get to traceability, which is the key, really the key question for all of these issues. And just to highlight one area that a number of investors are working on right now, beef in the cattle industry in Brazil. The key Brazilian meat packers there can't trace their supply chains past the first tier, despite commitments they made 10 years ago to do so. So they're missing the vast bulk of deforestation. So you can't just sort of accept that there's a policy in place. You really have to dig in on that. And the other thing, I think, to get back to the point that Michelle made earlier, when you get into conversations about implementation, it really helps you understand quality of management. It gives you a real sense of how well the company understands the issues and actually, you know, whether they know what they're doing. And you can't get to that if you stop at the policy. So strong policies are important, but don't stop there. It's step one. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Adam. Well taken. And I want to mention actually that in addition to the investor guide, there's a companion website on our Engage the Chain, or a companion page on our Engage the Chain site that provides a bit more background about some of the certifications and other things that Adam was talking about that we actually developed based on Adam's input, because some of these things can get quite complicated if you're new to them. So I encourage anyone who's less familiar with some of those to check out the website as well. So coming back to our discussion and coming back to the point about supply chains that you made earlier, Michelle, in Larry Fink's most recent letter to CEOs, he said that investors need a clear picture of how companies are managing sustainability-related questions, including the sustainability of supply chains. So how do you assess a company's management of deforestation exposure in its supply chain, and have you seen any progress in recent years on this topic among the companies in your portfolio?
Well, the sort of process starts, to points Adam made, on companies' own disclosures and the sort of integrity around the business model based on what the company is willing to put in the public domain. But absolutely, having a policy is insufficient. It's demonstrating that the policy is robust enough and is being fully implemented. and that there's a process for remedy if something goes wrong, either intentionally or a mishap. And so in terms of our analysis, we use a number of inputs, including the data aggregators that you mentioned already. Sometimes we'll use NGO reports because clearly they're on the ground usually and they have a deep knowledge of the issues. We look at companies' own disclosures. And then a hugely important part of this is looking at the company in line with its peers and whether we think the company is out of line with its peer group. Then, based on that analysis and the prioritization of companies to engage, we will meet with management, ideally senior management, not sort of people in silos like sustainability officers, although they have an important role to play clearly, and have a conversation asking quite detailed questions about the company's approach, why management thinks that's the appropriate approach given the risk profile of the issue, and then how the management team expects its practices to evolve over time as expectations on the company evolve. We give the company our feedback on that approach and where we think they stand in terms of our expectations of them, again, given the risks that the issue poses for the company. And then if we think that there needs to be change, we set out those expectations. And then we give companies time to go back to their sort of process analysis and look at where they can make improvements and then demonstrate those improvements. Where we don't see a commitment to change or the progress isn't fast enough, we'll look to engage the board, because ultimately as a long-term investor, we hold board directors accountable when companies fall short of really good business practices. If the board doesn't make progress or doesn't commit to progress, then we would vote against directors, basically holding them to account for not protecting the long-term interests of shareholders. And clearly, this is an iterative process. It's not a one-off conversation to points that Adam made. And we are adding our voice as a long-term investor to the voices that others are putting out in the discussion with companies, either through collaborative engagement, through sign-on letters, and through their own direct engagement. So in our experience, it's really valuable to have a very similar, consistent message delivered by different parties across that ecosystem, if you will, so that companies hear that this is a topic of concern and interest, and that they need to demonstrate that they're really addressing this in a robust and substantive way. And again, this is where the guide is, I think, incredibly useful, because it helps people focus. Because as we've already said, this is an incredibly complex issue, and most of us who will be engaging on the issue do not have the opportunity to become deep subject matter experts. And we're often facing off against company people who are deep subject matter experts. So the extent to which there are tools available that can help us make those connections and really be effective in our engagement in terms of holding senior leadership, corporate leadership to account, I think is hugely valuable.
Thanks, Michelle. And to follow up on that, you likely can't cite a specific engagement, but have there been any instances where you have seen progress on this topic? Or, overall, thinking about your engagements over the past several years, has there been progress, or are things sort of stalled?
I think there has been progress, particularly in the laggards, but there are real challenges, as others have already mentioned, and I think the driver of continued progress is when it's not just investors, but it's corporate leadership who commit to addressing these issues, where it's governments and regulators that hold up their side of the bargain, and where consumers start to make it central to their purchasing decisions, whether it's a customer of a supply chain, such as a big food producer, or individual consumers in their individual purchase decisions. But it's been, I think it's slow. There's sort of a leap forward, particularly when people sign on to policies or sign on to initiatives, and then it's backfilling to make sure that there's some real substance behind those commitments. And that's basically where disclosure becomes so important, because companies won't disclose generally something that can't be substantiated with actual practice and evidence. And for that disclosure framework, we're increasingly encouraging companies to look at the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, because that intellectual construct applies in our assessment to all aspects of environmental and social risk and opportunity in a business. So talk about the governance of the issue. How does your knowledge of that issue from that governance approach inform your long-term strategy, including your capital investments? How are you changing your risk management processes to capture and manage these risks? And then what metrics are you using to measure your performance, and what targets are you setting to manage your change? And so we think that having more robust disclosure is going to be key to better analysis and better evidence of change over time.
Thanks. I think many folks would agree with that. Adam, in the guide, we've really focused deeply on climate change and the connection with deforestation, because that seemed to be top of mind with a lot of investors. But what are other forest-related risks or issues that investors and companies should be looking out for on the horizon?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, first, as I said earlier, deforestation is one of those areas that covers so many issues, ranging from climate change to human rights issues, particularly the rights of indigenous peoples, to local water issues, to local economic community welfare. So there's a whole bunch of issues in there. The key issue that I've been spending a lot of time on this past year, and I think that unfortunately investors are really late to the game, is biodiversity. And clearly, addressing deforestation is a key strategy to preserving biodiversity. There's no question. But biodiversity is presents a larger set of questions, larger set of issues than forests. And it's an urgent crisis. And I worry that investors are pursuing climate goals without considering impacts to biodiversity. The latest science is telling us that we're not going to be able to meet the Paris goals without also preserving biodiversity, which is, I think, really important to keep in mind. But even if we could meet the Paris goals, we could cap global temperatures to 1.5 degrees, but it would be a classic Pyrrhic victory, to get to 1.5 degrees but lose biodiversity. We need to do both. And to prevent that, you need to wrestle with the complexity. And we need to stop thinking about forests and oceans as if they're simply carbon sinks. They are carbon sinks, but they're much, much more than that. There are several pathways to 1.5 degrees that depend upon carbon capture down the road. Carbon offsets that are implemented later mean species lost today and forever. So we really need to keep the biodiversity goals and the biodiversity impact in mind now. And when companies are talking about implementing carbon offsets, and particularly natural climate solutions like afforestation, they can't wait until 2040 or 2050 to implement those. If they do, and there are companies that I think kind of thinking about the offset piece later, they're going to do everything they can to reduce their emissions, and then if they don't quite get there, somewhere around 2040, 2050, 2045, 2050, they'll implement the offsets. You do it that way, we will guarantee that we will meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We will fail to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. You'll get to net zero on paper, but net zero on paper is meaningless. If you're going to use natural solutions to capture carbon, you have to do it early. It takes time for those systems to develop. It takes time for a forest to grow. It takes time for it to capture carbon. So you really need to, we need to be encouraging companies to be implementing those solutions today, and to be thinking with really tremendous urgency about the biodiversity crisis. And there's also a question, I think, for those of us that are working on deforestation issues, would we look at these issues differently if we put the lens of biodiversity on it as opposed to the lens of climate change? Would we think about it differently? And I think we might. I think it's important to keep in mind that forests are local, carbon is global. And so when you're addressing a local issue, you do it differently, and you have different considerations in mind. The other issue, which is sort of a larger issue, is just to keep in mind that commodities like palm oil and soy and beef and rubber, rubber, I'm sorry, set aside rubber for a moment, but palm oil, soy, and beef, they're not forest commodities. They're not derived from forests. The forests are simply in the way, and the trade-off is not worth it. I think we can do better than this, and I think we should be encouraging companies as we're working on the RSPO certification and soy certification and those key instrumental issues. We really should also be asking them, is it really necessary to cut down forest to grow soy, or to cut down forest to plant palm oil? Isn't there a better way to make your products? And I think there's not enough work done on those root cause issues. We really need to be smarter about that.
Thanks, Adam. Point well taken. And that's a great segue to my next question for Michelle. Michelle, during one of our earlier conversations, you mentioned that you're the daughter of a farmer. You're from New Zealand. And you've said that for global food companies, improving production practices and avoiding expansion of agriculture into forest aren't just rosy tinted, feel good things for companies to do, but are really about a long-term approach to stabilizing supply chains and businesses. Could you elaborate on that point a little bit?
So the key part of it is to the point that Adam made, agriculture as an industry, and then down the chain, the food producers as dependent on agricultural products, are both impacting climate and other natural resource stresses, but they're impacted by them as well. And so what we're seeing in a number of the global food manufacturing and consumer goods manufacturing companies is a real push to invest in their own supply chains by helping farmers develop better land use practices, to be more sort of organic, if you will, in their farming methods, because not only does it help them farm better and have better yields, it actually helps them become more skilled and actually builds a connection with the sponsoring company so that they have more resilience in their supply chain. And coming out of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing a lot of focus on resilience in supply chains, not just the shipping part of it, but the actual raw product part of it. And I do think one of the changes we're likely to see near term is better pricing of natural resources. So the actual externalities, my economics background coming through, factored into the pricing, which then makes the investment at the other side by companies into improving processes and methodologies and practices. It makes it more readily justified. One of the biggest issues around water use is that most people think water is free, but when you don't have water and you need to ship it in, it is absolutely not free. And so it is coming back to this thing, companies, investors, governments need to think more comprehensively about how to use these resources in a way that maximizes utility for society, but also ensures that there's a very long-term future in terms of being built into these business models and built into the way society thinks about natural resources.
Thanks, Michelle. I want to bring the discussion back to Jimmy. So Jimmy, one thing we talked about was that in the past, the New York City Comptroller has included climate risk mitigation and greenhouse gas emission reductions in your proxy voting guidance, and with some specific questions about energy efficiency and energy conservation. And bringing back to your earlier point about the relation of natural climate solutions or forest restoration and protection in relation to some of those other sources, have you, or would you consider addressing deforestation in that sort of guidance, to the extent that you can share with us?
Yeah, well, we're definitely certainly open to exploring how we can better integrate deforestation into our policies and processes and priorities. As you mentioned, we have a proxy voting guidance policy and corporate governance principles, which is available on our website and lists all the different issues that that we prioritize, and among them, of course, is climate change. And our policies include supporting companies taking action to develop policies around climate change, setting targets for reduction, and publicly reporting progress. So we view those existing policies as very directly applying to deforestation as a major component of climate risk. This report is new, and I haven't shared it with entirely with our staff yet, since the copy I had was embargoed. But I've already begun the discussion with various people in our team to explore, where we can think about deforestation already, what parts of our policy currently apply, and we'll certainly be thinking about how to better, what are the best ways and efficient ways and most effective ways to systematically address deforestation throughout our investment process.
Thanks, Jimmy. And another question for Michelle. How do you manage risks from deforestation and climate change for BlackRock's extensive index funds that are passively invested?
That is a core part of our investment strategy. Just so everybody's aware, about 90% of the approximately $3 trillion that we invest in equity strategies is in index. So the vast majority of our clients' holdings are through index strategies, which means that our clients are locked in long-term investors, and this is why environmental and social considerations are particularly important, and why engagement through our stewardship team is important, because our clients will be very long-term shareholders in companies. And our approach to engagement with index holdings is very similar to the approach we take when we're engaging with companies that are in active strategies, in the sense that our active strategies are also long-term focused. So we're coming from the place that 2/3 of our clients are saving for retirement. Therefore, we are presuming they're taking a long-term view on key business issues. And so the engagement is very much centered on prioritizing for companies where our clients have most value at risk, so they have pretty significant holdings in total, which also has the benefit of our vote will have more impact at those companies because our clients are in aggregate quite significant shareholders. And then we're looking at the impact the company has and how our feedback to the company may improve their business practices, and therefore we would prioritize those. We also look at companies who are leaders in their area to identify the drivers that made them take a lead on sustainability issues, whether it's deforestation or climate risk or water use, waste management, because those drivers can inform how the whole sector might move in time. And the key thing about engaging when you have an index holding is you're very clear in your messaging that we will be bringing this up to you this year, and we'll be monitoring what you do up until your next shareholder meeting. We'll be bringing it up next year in advance of your shareholder meeting. We will be here very long term, possibly even through the cycle of the current management team and board. And this issue will be something we will raise as long as we believe the company does not have an approach that is sufficiently aligned with delivering sustainable long-term value. And then that's where the vote becomes incredibly critical. Now, the sort of difficult part of engaging with companies that are held in an index is Some of our holdings are in companies that don't have good practices in relation to sustainability, including deforestation, and they also have a controlling shareholder. And so BlackRock's clients are a minority of minority shareholders, so the vote is less impactful. We will still engage, we will still explain our expectations, we'll still try to assess the likelihood of management changing their approach, but our ability to actually sanction management that don't make progress is much more limited in those companies that have controlling shareholders. Active managers are much less likely to be invested in those companies.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Adam, I want to bring it back to you and talk about one specific company expectation that you've mentioned. So in the investor guide, we discuss how eliminating deforestation can reduce a company's supply chain emissions. But during our discussions, you mentioned how it's really impossible for companies to assess that without traceability. Could you elaborate on that point a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. It's been a question in my mind for a long time. How it's possible for a company to say that they're fully reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, and then when you start to talk to them about deforestation, it turns out that they're unable to achieve full traceability in their soft commodity supply chains. To me, there's a clear disconnect there. Now, I know there's all sorts of ways of estimating greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm sure that's what they're relying on, but it does really beg the question. How can you be certain? How can you be certain that your greenhouse gas accounting is accurate if you can't fully trace your supply chain? If you don't know exactly where the palm oil is coming from and exactly what practices led to the production of that palm oil, even more importantly, exactly where the soy is coming from, exactly where the cattle that led to the beef you bought, that produced the beef you bought, where was it raised? We know that that's where all the deforestation is. And so I would guess that the greenhouse gas emissions are grossly underestimated for companies that have significant agricultural supply chains. So, it's yet another reason, I think, to engage on deforestation issues and soft commodity issues and supply chain traceability, is that if you believe that carbon accounting is critically important to get right, you need traceability, right? Companies need to fully understand that, and investors need to fully understand it. So the two kind of dialogues, I think, go hand in hand.
Thanks, Adam. So we're nearing the end of our session, but I'd like to pose one final question to each of our panelists. Based on our conversation today, is there one piece of advice that you would give an investor who's just starting to engage on deforestation, or alternately one point from the discussion that you really want to emphasize? So Jimmy, let's start with you.
Sure. I guess I would sort of reiterate something that I just talked about, which is for asset owners and investors who've not been working deeply on deforestation to really systematically examine their policies on where deforestation naturally fits in, where deforestation comes into play, and where you have to apply your policies more directly to deforestation issues in your engagement and other investment work, and think about whether there are appropriate ways to explicitly integrate deforestation into your policies and beliefs. So I think just starting from the basics in terms of your overall approach.
Thanks. I think that's a great place for folks to start. Michelle, let's turn to you.
Well, it would be remiss not to say read the guide that Ceres was publishing from cover to cover, because it is a really useful tool. But there are also other tools available to investors, and I think really scoping the landscape for all of the information that is available, whether it's from specialist groups like Ceres or business-facing groups like McKinsey. There's a lot of information there, and use that to draft your own policy position and engagement strategy so that you can clearly think, as Jimmy said, how this fits into your overall priorities. Because most of us are not ever engaging on a single issue. All of these things are really connected, but we need to work out where those connections are and how we prioritize, because focus is hugely important if you want to achieve any results.
Thanks, Michelle, and appreciate that plug for the investor guide. So let's turn to Adam, your final thoughts.
Sure. So one sort of broader thought and one plug. So first, keep in mind deforestation is a systemic risk. So when you're engaging with companies, yes, there are going to be, in some cases, material financial risks to that company. There's also going to be many cases where the company itself is making significant contributions to systemic risk because they are contributing to deforestation, even if they may be somewhat shielded from the risk themselves. So we need to keep that in mind. And sort of one illustration of that, I think it's fair to say that deforestation helped to bring our economies to a near standstill this year. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. It leaped from wildlife to humans, presumably due to the wildlife trade, which is linked to deforestation. Up to 75% of all emerging diseases are zoonotic. 75%. So that means that we're going to be seeing more of these. Hopefully we won't be seeing more pandemics, but it's likely that we will, because climate change is going to make this stuff worse. And increasing deforestation is going to make it worse. Forests and intact ecosystems, biodiversity, help to protect us from these kinds of threats, which are key systemic risks. And there's just sort of no doubt of the financial materiality of these questions, if you look at it from a systemic level. So if you don't have enough reasons yet to work on deforestation, think about the pandemic as another reason. You're working home today because of deforestation. There's a few links in that chain, but the links are there. The plug that I'll make that we haven't mentioned today at all. First, we need more investors to get involved in this issue. The plug is for the Investor Initiative for Sustainable Forests, which Ceres and PRI have been coordinating for a number of years now. We are really strong believers in collaborative engagements, and this is really a great one. It helps, I think, to have the able assistance of experts at Ceres and at PRI to work you through the dialogue to help identify which companies to engage, and to help move those dialogues along, to bring in outside experts when we need them. It's a great learning experience to work with the folks at Ceres and PRI, but also with other committed investors from around the world, and to kind of pool our knowledge. And I think we can be so much more effective that way. So please, if you want to get involved, that's a great way. That's a great way to get started.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you so much for that great segue into the final piece of this presentation, which is just to thank all of you for taking part in today's event. And a special thanks to Michelle, Jimmy, and Adam for sharing your thoughts with us. For all of you on the line, you can download the investor guide, as well as access to a great deal of research and material available about climate change and deforestation at engagethechain.org. And we encourage you to view and access the information in this and other resources. So as Adam mentioned, for those of you interested in taking the next step, Ceres does coordinate a number of networks, including the Investor Initiative of Sustainable Forests, that offer investors the opportunity to collaborate on deforestation and climate change. These are all described in the last part of the investor guide, or feel free to contact me at the email address here to learn more. My colleagues and I would be really happy to connect with you. So you'll all receive a follow-up email shortly with a recording of this session, as well as a link to download the investor guide. And we hope you found this session really informative and useful as you think about deforestation in your engagements or in your work. So thank you again, and have a wonderful day.